What is the UK university experience about? Well, I've reviewed 3 different sitcoms set on location to find out. This video is an examination of how TV depicts students, staff, and university in general, whether it aligns with the heady experience we all remember, or whether it shows us something else entirely. Come with me then, back to the very recent past. Bring your poorly judged outfit, bring your weird alco pop, bring your total lack of self-awareness. Let's analyse some TV.
Oh, well, of course you must have vegetables!
Let's start with a dash of context, a lick of history for our comedy coffee. The university sitcom format starts in the 80s with the cult comedy The Young Ones. But I haven't seen The Young Ones, so I'm not going to bother discussing it here. Our story starts in 2010. Prime Minister David Cameron and Sub-Prime Minister Nick Clegg have just announced that they'll be trebling tuition fees. Every single aspect of student life in the next 10 years exists in the shadow of this decision. And it feeds into the culture too, as we'll see in our first programme. So the first sitcom I'm going to be discussing today is Fresh Meat. It seems like the best place to start. It's got the highest ratings, it was written by Jesse Armstrong and Sam Bain of former Peep Show fame, and it's even got a redemption arc for Jack Whitehall.
This really isn't working as a come-on.
Which most people didn't think was possible. The programme centres around 6 freshers who share a student house at a facsimile of the University of Manchester. There's Rods, rebellious and provocative, Kingsley, boring and indie, so doubly boring, Oregon, an upper middle class hipster, Howard, comic relief weirdo, JP, Toff, and Josie, Welsh. The plotting and characterisation for Fresh Meat was largely inspired by the 80s cult comedy The Young Ones, but I haven't seen The Young Ones, so I'm not going to bother discussing it here. Fresh Meat ran for 4 series between 2011 and 2016. In this respect, its run encompassed many important moments in the history of higher education. In Series 1, Episode 5, the group attend an anti-tuition fee protest in central London.
I was a virgin, I am now no longer a virgin.
In real life, as many as 50,000 protesters are estimated to have taken to the streets on the 10th of November 2010, only to be subject to police brutality, whether they were actually violent protesters, or, as was much more often the case, not violent at all. This wasn't the only major demonstration of the decade. University staff went on strike in 2013, and then really went on strike after Fresh Meat ended. In fact, strikes by academics since have been a lot like British drizzle. Unpredictable, intermittent, and a great excuse to stay in and blaze it instead of going to your lecture. But Fresh Meat doesn't really go into this topic, because it's much more about the student experience than it is about the staff one. Episodes of Fresh Meat focus in on individual foibles of student life, from Series 1, Episode 2, House Parties, Series 1, Episode 3, Dating, to the aforementioned protests in Episode 5. What I'm more interested in is the bookends though, how Fresh Meat presents the beginning and the end of university. What students expect to get from university when they arrive, and how students feel about university and their future beyond it when they leave. Let's start with Series 2, Episode 3, which focuses on Howard, Kingsley, and JP battling for an internship with BP. At the time, BP were a pretty toxic entity, owing to the recent memory of their spill-ups in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, thankfully, a totally different company operating in a totally different sector seems to get most of the climate change hate. Later in the episode, Kingsley sits down with Josie, who talks to him about how, if you want something, you have to go out and get it.
When we leave this place, it's going to be fucking Darwinian out there. So if there's something you want, that you want to be part of your future, then you have to go after it right now.
And she cites some wise figures for unemployment among under 25s to encourage him to compete.
Do you know how many people under 24 are unemployed? About 20%, and it's only going up.
The subtext here is that Josie is really angling about her feelings for Kingsley, and his feelings for her. A subtext the viewer finds amusing, and Kingsley finds bemusing, because it's impossible to wear a fedora and have a brain at the same time. Regardless, this entire episode and its conclusion, where no one gets the internship and no one is satisfied either sexually or professionally, is emblematic of Fresh Meat's general take. Episodes later in this series further emphasise that careers are hugely central to the university experience and a massive distraction from it.
The average starting salary for the UK graduate is currently just under £22,000, Jonathan.
In Series 3, for example, Vod's new job as a hotel cleaner puts her academic performance in jeopardy. But it's a job she only had to take on because of the precarity of her university funding. But in general, Fresh Meat seems to see university as some kind of great leveller. In the student house, we see 6 people of broadly different backgrounds, all brought together by their studies that they can, at least prospectively, manage to afford. It almost seems strange now to look at Vod, the only member of the house who regularly works, as an exceptional case. Nowadays, more and more undergraduates are being forced to take on at least one part-time job, as further education becomes more expensive, more precarious, and less accessible as a result. This is one respect in which Fresh Meat very much seems to be a window onto the past. But the view of careers as either an obsession or a distraction at uni hasn't really changed since. It's only gotten more intense. Changing tack slightly, Fresh Meat also does a great job of showing how relationships and friendships change over the course of university. Kingsley and Josie start off in a will they won't they kind of situation, only to realise that they're not right for a serious relationship together. Howard starts off being weird enough to alienate everyone else.
And water will accumulate like that after a big rain. That's classic.
But eventually establishes himself as a kind and earnest member of the friendship group. Oregon starts off masking everything she does and pretending to be someone else, bonding with Vod purely by repeating her sentences.
Gonna wait for a party, force feed him tequila and jump on him.
Classic.
By the end, Oregon and Vod are actually friends because they recognise each other's more deep-set personalities.
Yeah, it was there, yeah. And it did have, a lot of it was about people thinking that, pretending to be one thing and actually there's something else.
I think this is crucial to appraising how we think about university. We go in presenting perfect, ready to serve instant coffee to any folk who poke their head into our accommodation corridor, armed with photos, anecdotes, and a willingness to go to, by all accounts, terrible club nights. However, as we spend more time with our new support network, we stop masking so much and present a more comfortable version of our own personalities. Meanwhile, professionally, we go in with lofty expectations about what we'll get out of university. Angling internships, work experience placements, or worse, leadership positions in sci-fi and fantasy society. And we end up, well, in the final episode, the gang each find out their degree classification and decide what they're going to do next. JP has spent a year pussyfooting around dirty cartoons as a choice of career, but eventually decides he can't afford to do it full time and becomes an estate agent instead. Kingsley gets an internship in internet radio, but because it's unpaid, he has to compromise other aspects of his life to make it work. Howard gets, in effect, his dream job, but he's struck by anxiety and fear that he can't actually do it. Oregon and Vod fob it off and go abroad for a bit. And Josie, held back a year, recognises that all these suboptimal options are in her immediate future. Abandoning your passion for a corpo role, sacrificing your salary to do what you might like, convincing yourself that you don't deserve that grad job, or just putting it all off for another day. In the show, everyone gets blasted and makes peace with this, but it doesn't change the fact that this is the reality for the 21st century graduate. Excluding the hilarious cop-out of doing a master's, of course.
What are you doing? I'm desperate, so I'm applying for a PGCE.
So this final episode is all about the bittersweet endings of university and the stress associated with the next step. This one feels worrisome, uncertain, stacked with the possibility of debt and harm and upset and debt and also debt. It's tinged with nostalgia, as is any step from one period of life to the next, but it's mostly just scary. The final scene of the series is Josie walking around the now empty student house, then walking out into the streets and the middle distance, while sad indie plays in the background.
I'm feeling a strong 3 to a light 4.
The first time I watched this, I think I was just finishing my undergrad. It really hit me hard. I think part of the reason why is because Fresh Meat spends so much of its time being almost flippant about real lived experiences and aspiring to something more zany.
Get the fuck in, you bitch, it's tequila slammer time.
I mean, I suppose you could argue that its emphasis on comedy is a good thing, that it helps evoke the more comic elements of the student experience. When I first watched it as a fresher, I thought it was spot on in terms of its depiction. It's a careful balanced strike though, between the heartfelt and the zany, though it's notable that the ending of Peep Show tried to do a similar thing. But this isn't the only approach, as we'll see next. Big Boys aired in summer 2022 on Channel 4, more than 10 years after the first pilot of Fresh Meat. However, it's set at more or less the same time, with its first series taking place around 2013. A notable difference is that Big Boys is actually a docu-comedy. Is that a thing? Based on the experience of its lead writer, Jack Rook. It tells the story of his foibles at university along with mature student Danny and the little band of mates. While Rook suggested that not everything in Big Boys is based on lived experience, you do get the impression that most of its story beats are a bit more down to earth. I think that does Big Boys a favour though. To be honest, watching Fresh Meat now, there's the occasional moment that feels like it pushes a bit too far into the weird to be based on relatable university moments.
Oh, it's just a revision timetable.
Quick diversion. You've probably heard of Community, the US college comedy written by Surly Cockshield Dan Harmon. Community is completely different to the stuff I've discussed so far. On the one hand, each episode is ostensibly about a single college class. On the other hand, absolutely none of them pay heed to reality. So if that's one end of the spectrum, Big Boys is the other, and Fresh Meat is somewhere in the middle. Because look, Big Boys talks about things Fresh Meat doesn't. The main story threads are Jack processing the death of his dad and coming out to his mum, while Danny struggles with depression and supporting his grandma through dementia. Meanwhile, their friends Corin and Yemi go through less detailed but equally tender character development. This is in one series of 6 23-minute episodes. Fresh Meat had 4 series, 30 episodes, and 41 minutes each. That Big Boys manages to cram in arguably more moments of real tenderness, relatability, and compassion is testament to its writing. But it also demonstrates that these two shows are trying to do arguably quite different things, and we shouldn't necessarily knock one or the other for it. Fresh Meat leans into its lightheartedness, while Big Boys is more cynical, but also true to life. While I'm not sure I've had many of the experiences from Fresh Meat, I've never released crude oil at a drinks reception, or mashed a university administrator, or alienated my flatmates with my taste in independent music. I've done that one. Okay, well I haven't done many of those things. I have done most of the things in Big Boys, at least those that aren't specific to the old LGBTQ with the plus. The way it pictures pub meets, for example, feels real, as opposed to oddly frequent and constructed. The way it depicts the subtle, slow burn relationships we develop with our flatmates and our course mates also feels really convincing. The layers of awkward pastry that give way to a soppy inner filling, if this analogy was a pie. And while Fresh Meat only looks at other characters tangentially so far as they relate to the central 6, Big Boys gives starring roles to its support network. Mums are evidently major. Jax is processing the absence of her husband and now her son, while Danny's grandmum is deteriorating before his eyes every time he manages to get home. And that, I suppose, shows how university poses challenges from without as well as within, particularly for an increasingly economically precarious society. In the way all these different issues interlace with one another, the series shows us how we struggle to be fully open even with those we intimately know. If I haven't made it clear up to now, I think this series is really good, and I think you should watch it. You should watch it! Worth bearing in mind though, Big Boys does cover some similar ground to Fresh Meat. Drug-taking scenes played for comedic effect, fancying your professor, and most obviously, getting completely shafted with university accommodation.
Oh shit.
But it also covers a lot more of the administrative probs that Fresh Meat chooses to gloss over, such as the massive form-filling exercise that Danny has to fill out in order to stay on at university. Big Boys demonstrates how often the university has the power to shut students down, locking them out of parties, straight up forgetting about them, or totally ignoring their mental health. So this show is at once character focused and aware of the systemic problems beyond its characters. I think that's a fantastic achievement, and I think that's spot on, but I told you we'd discuss 3 campus comedies today, and I think it's time to reveal our final contender. The best worst university themed sitcom made in the UK set in the 2010s that's publicly available to stream now! Gosh, what an accolade! Campus is a raucous and now deeply cancelable sitcom that focuses on the lives of university staff, as opposed to students. Released barely after the last but one tuition fee increase in 2011, and covering the activities of a series of staff at the fictional Kirk University, it masterfully foresaw the shift in UK universities away from teaching and research towards everything else. That's not to say you should watch Campus. If you do, you should watch it carefully. The show's thoughtless in its depiction of mental health, disability, ethnicity, and most obviously sex. Protagonist and University Vice-Chancellor Jonty is like a particularly unhinged variant of David Brent. So the gist of the story is that Jonty gets a visit from early career Katherine Ryan, playing an Ice Queen Canadian who tells him he has to save loads of money. To accomplish this, he enlists the mathematician with a book out, Imogen Moffat, lazy but Lothario English prof Matthew Beer, bumbling accountant Jason Armitage, and useless PGTA Flat Pack. Let's put those big boys aside for a second. Campus ticks all the right stereotypes. The money-obsessed and academically uncaring vice-chancellor, the rock-star mathematician, the scandalous layabout, and the hapless administrator. But what Campus does really well is reveal the hidden work that happens at universities. Things people assume universities don't do based on outdated idealisms of quadrangles and obscenely flat hats. Universities do have entire offices of secretaries and accountants. Universities do have expenditure meetings. Universities do interview academics to establish the value they add to their bottom line. And within the framing that Campus chooses, students are a complete afterthought. In the life of Jonty DeWolf, whose role as a joke character is apt seeing as he's a vice-chancellor, students serve for little more than generating media attention and tuition fee funding.
You have to die.
And in the lives of Flat Pack and Matt Beer, students are an obstacle to be avoided.
What's this?
My Byron essay?
And grading is a nuisance lottery.
The Lyric Impulse, Colin Foley.
Good essay. I thought he developed his argument with some genuine flair.
Fair enough. It's all down to you then.
2-1.
That part isn't even that far from the truth in some institutions. But the saddest thing is, these staff aren't even happy with this flippant, laissez-faire approach to education. They're desperately unhappy because they work in a system where their job is constantly under threat, where they're monitored to gauge their achievements, and where, realistically, they can't actually be themselves. Professor Beer, by far the most contemptible character otherwise, has written a beautiful book of poems, but he can't pursue it as a career because there's no money in it. Success is just as constraining. As soon as Professor Moffat's book is finished, she's forced into writing another one, whether she wants to or not. Flatpack just wants to be an athlete, but he only has enough time to train because he has a full-time stipend in education. And transparently, Jonty wants to be a magician.
Close!
So he spends his time manipulating people at university instead. But all of these problems, these misalignments between desire and outcome, are blown out of proportion by the government's long-standing throttling of the university sector and throttling of academics' hopes and dreams as a result. Real salaries have dropped by 17% since 2009, while workloads have only increased. And we have the Jonty DeWolfs and their overseers to thank for that. So how about this? What if Campus, like Fresh Meat, is about pretending to be someone else? Except instead of being about pretentious students, it's about academics trying to stay afloat in the brackish waters of academia. It's all bloody facades, man. I suppose it's a pity that the most useful TV depiction of British university life is the one that's also the most politically incorrect. When Campus ended after only one series, it had received the second largest quantity of complaints of any programme on Channel 4 that year. Plot twist! The complaints weren't about the xenophobia, they were all calls to reverse the programme's cancellation.
Must be love.
Oh, and you're some kind of expert, are you?
The sheer weird of Campus had won over its small audience, assigning cult status to its cack-handed callousness. So viewer beware, but there's some gems in this rocky terrain, I'll tell you. So let's sum up. 3 Campus comedies with 3 pretty distinctive takes on what the university experience really is. Fresh Meat tells us of the uncertainty of university, the constraints it places on students to pursue their passions, and the crazy ideas and madcap schemes we deploy as a coping mechanism. Big Boys tells us how solidarity and a support network can make things easier at university, but they can't break down all the fundamental systems that make things more difficult. And Campus? Campus tells us how this is all a complete joke to the powers that be. But these three taken together show us that the issues faced by staff and students at university are never mutually exclusive, they're mutually reinforcing. We can recreate a university sector that works for everyone then. Notice I said recreate, as we did have one once, last century, though I'm not sure if there's a show that covers it. Anywho, as I said in my last video, we need to recognise how far we've strayed from the university systems that worked, and consider whether the new frameworks we've built create more caring, thoughtful Jacks, or more cruel, ruthless Jonties. But I'll be honest, if I'd had to watch 40 hours of semi-half-decent TV to figure that one out, I'd want 40 hours of my life back. But at least it wasn't 3 to 4 years and 50 grand of debt, eh lads?